The stars looked exactly as they had 100 years ago. Cold, silent, eternal. But everything beneath them had changed. Captain Da Young stood on the bridge of the Earth patrol ship Guardian, staring at the enormous view screen as yet another diplomatic conference dragged on without progress. Alien delegates argued. Accusations were exchanged. Promises were made. Nothing changed. Da Young sighed. He had been stationed along the frontier for 3 years. Long enough to recognize the pattern. Every crisis began with speeches. Every tragedy ended with silence. He wasn't tired in the ordinary sense. Sleep could fix ordinary exhaustion. This was something deeper, the kind of weariness that settled into a person's soul after watching innocent people suffer, while politicians debated definitions. Outside the ship stretched one of the most dangerous borders in the galaxy. On one side, the Vrex Dominion, a civilization that measured strength by conquest. Its people admired warriors above scholars, victories above justice, and believed that if a weaker civilization couldn't defend its worlds, it didn't deserve to keep them. On the other side, the Quillen Commonwealth. Gentle beings with shimmering silver scales and graceful bodies that resembled fish walking upright. They had never built an invasion fleet. Never started a war. Never fired the first shot in their entire recorded history. They believed every disagreement could be solved through understanding. Unfortunately, the Vrex did not share that belief. For 3 long years, Da Young and his crew had watched the same story repeat itself. A Quillen colony would disappear, another border station would fall, another plea for help would reach the Galactic Council. Then the debates would begin. By the time a decision was made, the Vrex had already claimed another planet. Nothing ever changed. Lieutenant Hana sat at the navigation console, her fingers moving effortlessly across glowing controls. She had joined the mission fresh out of the academy, convinced that diplomacy was the greatest weapon humanity possessed. Back then, she believed every conflict had a peaceful solution. 3 years later, that belief had been tested more times than she could count. It had grown weaker, but somehow, it had never completely disappeared. She glanced at the conference still playing on the main screen. The Vrex ambassador was denying every accusation despite overwhelming evidence. The Quillen representative pleaded for international protection. Council members argued over legal procedures. Hana quietly shook her head. They're wasting time again. Da Young didn't answer immediately. His eyes never left the stars beyond the bridge. Finally he spoke. They always do. His voice carried no anger. Only disappointment. Every hour they spend arguing, another family loses a home. Another colony disappears. Another promise is broken. Silence settled across the bridge. Everyone knew he was right. A young communications officer suddenly turned from his console. "Captain?" His voice sounded uncertain. "We've just received another emergency transmission." Da Young looked over. "Source?" The officer swallowed. "A Quillen border colony." The bridge instantly became alert. The transmission appeared on the main screen. Static filled the air. Then a frightened Quillen voice broke through. "This is Colony 17. They're here." Explosions echoed in the background. "The Vrex fleet has crossed the border. We've activated every distress beacon." A child cried somewhere behind the speaker. "They're landing troops." Another explosion shook the recording. "We can't hold them." Static consumed the signal. Then, nothing. The bridge fell completely silent. Hana slowly looked toward Da Young. The council won't approve intervention in time. He already knew. The nearest council fleet was nearly 5 days away. The colony would be gone in less than 5 hours. Da Young stared at the empty screen for a long moment. Then he stood. Every member of the bridge crew instinctively looked toward him. His decision had already been made. "Set course for Colony 17. Hana hesitated. "Captain, we don't have authorization." Da Young turned toward the crew. His expression was calm, but his eyes had changed. Neither did the Vrex. The bridge remained silent. Then, one by one, every officer nodded. The engines of the Guardian roared to life. For the first time in 3 years, humanity was no longer going to observe history. It was about to change it. She still believed even when it hurt to believe. Tamman, the medical officer, kept himself busy in the medical bay. He said he preferred working with bodies rather than politics, because bodies made sense. Aura, the chief engineer, spent most of her time in the engine room, keeping the ship running and muttering about how they should just go home. The year was 2347, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Council for 112 years. It had been a strange century for humans. They arrived in the galaxy expecting adventure and discovery, and they found it. But they also found something else. Something they had not expected. They found that most species in the galaxy solved their problems with threats and violence, and someone needed to stand between them to stop the killing. That someone became humanity slowly, gradually, without anyone really deciding it. Humans became the galaxy's mediators. When two species wanted to fight over a planet, humans stepped in to negotiate. When resources needed to be divided, humans found the compromise. When ancient grudges threatened to explode into war, humans talked everyone down from the edge. They did this again and again, year after year, until it became expected. The problem was that negotiation required giving things up. It meant making both sides a little bit unhappy, so they would stop being very angry. And since humans were the ones doing the negotiating, they often gave up their own things to make deals work. A human colony here, a mining operation there, territorial claims that got quietly abandoned. Each sacrifice was small, but they added up over a century. Other species noticed this pattern. They saw that humans would always choose peace over pride, negotiation over conflict, compromise over standing firm. Some species respected this quality. They thought humans were wise and mature, elevated above the petty squabbling that consumed younger civilizations. But other species saw something different. They saw weakness. They saw a species that could be pushed, tested, and exploited. The Vrex were experts at exploitation. Their empire had grown fat over the decades, swallowing world after world through a simple strategy. They would find a planet they wanted, usually one occupied by someone weaker. Then they would manufacture some historical claim, saying their ancestors had lived there 1,000 years ago, or that the planet sat within their traditional territory. The claims were always lies, but they were backed by warships, so the lies did not need to be convincing. Once the claim was made, the Vex would wait for human diplomats to arrive. The humans always came, desperate to prevent bloodshed. Then the negotiation dance would begin, with the Vex demanding everything, and the humans trying to find middle ground. Eventually, a deal would emerge where the Vex got most of what they wanted. The weaker species got to survive, and the humans paid the difference out of their own pocket. This had happened 17 times in just the past decade. 17 times the Vex had expanded, and 17 times humanity had negotiated away the problem rather than confronting it. The Quillen had lost 6 worlds this way, their population shrinking and scattering across the galaxy as refugees. Some of those refugees ended up on human worlds, welcomed and sheltered. While the Vex laughed at human generosity, Ambassador Hyan represented Earth at the Galactic Council station. He was a small man with gray hair and tired eyes, and he had been arguing for peace for 20 years. His office walls were covered with photos of successful negotiations, peace treaties signed, wars prevented. But lately, he found himself staring at those photos and wondering if success looked different than he had imagined. Prevention was good, but it was not victory. It was just postponing the inevitable. In the council chambers, representatives from 47 species gathered to discuss galactic affairs. The humans always sat in the same seats, always proposed the same solutions, always worked harder than anyone else to keep the peace behind closed doors. Some species called them saints, others called them fools. A few called them doormats, and those few were not entirely wrong. De Jong received another message from the Vrex commander requesting a meeting. He sighed and told Hana to prepare a shuttle. Another day, another negotiation, another small surrender in the name of peace. The captain did not know it yet, but the universe was running out of patience faster than his ship could generate it. Nova U was beautiful in the morning light. The colony world had taken 20 years of hard work to transform from a dusty rock into something that could support life. 80,000 humans called it home now. along with 15,000 Krillin refugees who had nowhere else to go. Governor Yuna walked through the central plaza every morning, greeting her people and checking on their needs. She loved this place, loved what they had built together. The terraforming had been expensive and difficult. Every tree had been planted by hand, every field prepared with care, every river channeled with precision. The colonists had poured their lives into this world, and it showed. Children played in parks that had not existed 5 years ago. Farms produced food that fed the entire colony. Small towns dotted the landscape, each one a testament to human determination and hope. The Quillen refugees had integrated smoothly into colony life. They were good neighbors, grateful for the shelter and eager to contribute. Their children attended school alongside human children, learning the same lessons and playing the same games. It was the kind of peaceful coexistence that the Galactic Council liked to celebrate in their promotional materials. Look how well different species could live together when given the chance. Then the Vrex arrived, and peace became complicated again. Their fleet appeared in orbit one morning without warning, 20 warships bristling with weapons. The Rex commander broadcast a message to the entire colony. He claimed that Nova Jews sat within historical Rex territory and demanded that everyone leave within 30 days. The claim was absurd, completely made up, but it came with enough firepower to make lies sound like truth. Governor Yuna immediately contacted Ambassador Hyan at the Galactic Council. She explained the situation, the ridiculous claim, the threat hanging over her people. Hyan listened with sympathy and frustration. He had heard this exact story too many times before. He promised to send negotiators and told her to stay calm, that humanity would find a peaceful solution. Yuna wanted to believe him, but belief was getting harder. Captain De Jong and the Endless Patience were the closest diplomatic vessel, so they got the assignment. It took them 4 days to reach Nova, and by the time they arrived, the Vex had already started making additional demands. They wanted compensation for the colonists having illegally occupied their territory. They wanted formal apologies. They wanted humans to help relocate the Quillen refugees somewhere else, preferably somewhere far away. The negotiations began in the conference room of the Endless Patience. The Vrex commander, a massive creature named Thra, attended the meetings with obvious amusement. He did not take the discussion seriously because he did not need to. His ships controlled the space around Nova U, and everyone knew it. When Daejeong proposed compromises, Thra would laugh and demand more. When Daejeong appealed to reason, Thrak would make threats. 6 weeks passed this way, with Daejeong shuttling between his ship and the Vrex fleet, trying to find some agreement that would save the colony. His crew watched him grow more exhausted each day. Hana started having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night, worrying about the families on Nova Jew. Thyman stopped making jokes during meals, and Bora became short-tempered with everyone. The stress of constant negotiation wore them all down. Back on Earth, Fleet Admiral Kwan sat in her office at the United Nations of Earth headquarters, reading reports from across human space. Nova was just one problem among dozens. Human colonies faced challenges on 15 different borders, each one following the same pattern. An aggressive species would make demands, human diplomats would negotiate, and eventually some sort of compromise would emerge that left humans with less than they started with. Kwan had access to information that most people did not see. She knew the exact number of colonies abandoned in the past century, the resources surrendered, the territorial claims withdrawn. She also knew something else that very few people knew. During the entire century of human diplomacy, while Earth appeared focused solely on peace, the military had been preparing for something else. Every ship had hidden capabilities. Every colony had secret defenses. Every soldier trained for a war that everyone hoped would never come. The Admiral's office walls displayed star maps showing human territory. A century ago, human space had been expanding rapidly. Now it looked like a piece of cheese with bites taken out of it. Chunks missing here and there, where colonies had been given up or abandoned. Kwan stared at those maps often, wondering when the biting would stop, wondering if it ever would. Her tactical officer, Jiwan, brought her daily intelligence reports. The reports showed increasing coordination among aggressive species. The Vex were the worst, but others were learning from their success. If humans could be pushed on one border, they could be pushed on all borders. If humanity valued peace above everything else, then threatening peace became the ultimate leverage. Intelligence Director Minho had even more concerning news. His agents reported that some species were actively mocking humanity in their private communications. They had jokes about human weakness, about how easy it was to take things from them. One intercepted message described negotiations with humans as like taking food from a child who does not want to see anyone go hungry. Governor Yuna sent another message to Ambassador Hyan, this one more desperate. She told him that her people were scared, that they had worked too hard to give up their home without a fight. She asked him, please, could humanity stand firm just once? Could they tell the Vex no, and mean it? Hyan replied with sympathy, but also with reality. His orders from Earth were clear. Maintain peace at any cost. Find a compromise. Prevent the shooting from starting. On Nova Jeju, colonists began packing their belongings, preparing for another retreat. They did it quietly. Sadly, with the resignation of people who had seen this pattern before, the Quillen refugees packed too, wondering where they would go next, how many more times they would need to flee before finding a place they could keep. Thra grew impatient with the slow pace of evacuation. He wanted the planet cleared faster, wanted to move on to his next conquest. He started making more aggressive demands during negotiations. His patience wearing thin, Dejung could see the danger building, but felt powerless to stop it. He was a diplomat with words as his only weapon. Facing a warrior who valued only strength, the galaxy watched Nova Jeju with mild interest. Another minor incident in the endless cycle of stronger species pushing weaker ones around. No one expected anything different to happen. The pattern was too well established, too predictable. Humans would negotiate, sacrifice something, and everyone would move on until the next time. The morning started like any other morning on Nova Jeju. Children woke up, got dressed, ate breakfast, and headed to school. Parents went to work in fields and factories. The Quillen refugees opened their shops and began their daily routines. Everyone had grown somewhat used to the Vray ships hanging in orbit like dark clouds, threatening, but not yet delivering rain. Governor Yuna had not slept well in weeks. She spent her mornings reviewing evacuation plans that she hated, signing documents that felt like surrenders. Today she had a meeting scheduled with the school board to discuss how to help children cope with the stress of potentially losing their homes. It was the kind of meeting she never imagined having when she accepted the governor position. Up on the endless patience, Captain De Jong prepared for another round of negotiations with Thra. The Vex commander had been even more aggressive lately, his demands growing more unreasonable each day. De Jong's crew could see their captain struggling, searching for compromises where none existed. Anna brought him coffee and told him to eat something. He thanked her, but did not touch the food. Ambassador Hyan contacted De Jong from the Galactic Council Station, offering advice and encouragement. They both knew the situation was deteriorating, but neither could see a way out. The Council had discussed Nova Jeju in session yesterday, and most species sided with the Vrex. Historical territorial claims, no matter how ridiculous, carried weight in galactic law. The fact that the claims were obviously false did not matter when backed by sufficient military force. Thrax sat on his flagship, growing increasingly frustrated with the delays. He had given these humans more than enough time to evacuate. His orders from the Vrex High Command were clear. Secure Nova Jeju by any means necessary. The planet had rich mineral deposits that the Empire wanted, and a Vrex colony ship was already en route, carrying settlers eager to claim this new world. The Vex commander decided that the negotiations needed motivation. He ordered his weapons officer to prepare a demonstration strike, something to show the humans he was serious. The target would be Nova Jeju's orbital infrastructure, the satellites and supply depots floating above the planet. Destroying unmanned facilities would send a message without actually killing anyone. It was the kind of aggressive push that had worked many times before. The weapons officer on Thrax's flagship was named Vec, and he was not particularly good at his job. He had gotten the position through family connections rather than skill, and he was often careless with details. When Thrak ordered the demonstration strike, V programmed the targeting computer quickly, not bothering to triple-check his coordinates like he should have. He locked onto what he thought was a supply depot and fired. The plasma torpedo launched from the Rex flagship, a streak of blue fire crossing the space between orbit and atmosphere. It moved fast, too fast for anyone to intercept or redirect. The weapons guidance system followed Vex programming exactly, heading straight for its designated target. Only the target was not a supply depot. Nova Jeju Elementary School sat on a hill overlooking the colony's central town. It was a beautiful building designed with large windows to let in natural light. This morning, as every morning, children filled its classrooms. First graders learning to read, fourth graders studying math, sixth graders discussing history, human children and Quillen children sitting side by side learning together. Teacher Mai was in the middle of explaining fractions to her third-grade class when the sky turned blue. She looked up confused and had just enough time to wonder what was happening before everything ended. The plasma torpedo hit the school directly, vaporizing the building and everyone inside it in a fraction of a second. There was no pain, no time to be afraid. One moment they existed, and the next they were gone. The explosion could be seen from anywhere in the colony, a blue flash followed by a mushroom cloud of fire and debris. Alarms started blaring across Nova Ju. Emergency systems activating too late to help. Governor Yuna was in her office when her aide burst through the door, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak, just pointing at the window where smoke rose in the distance. Captain De Jong was reviewing documents when every alarm on his bridge started screaming at once. Anna spun in her chair, her face going white as she read the sensor data. Tammin arrived from the medical bay, demanding to know what happened. Bora's voice came over the comm from engineering, shaking with rage and horror. The sensors told a simple, terrible story. Weapon launch from VRE flagship. Impact on planetary surface. Massive casualties detected. 347 children died in that explosion. Their names would later be carved into a memorial, each one remembered individually. Mai and 6 other teachers died with them, along with the school's principal and 2 maintenance workers. The building that had taken 2 years to construct disappeared in seconds, leaving only a crater and scattered debris. De Jong immediately opened a channel to Thrax's flagship, his voice cold and controlled despite the fury burning in his chest. He demanded an explanation, an apology, something to make sense of the senseless. Thrak appeared on the view screen, and what happened next would be remembered forever. The Vrex commander showed no remorse. He called it collateral damage, an unfortunate accident, regrettable, but inevitable in these situations. Then he suggested that if the humans had simply evacuated when ordered, no one would have died. Thra gave De Jong 6 hours to begin the full evacuation of Nova Ju or face more accidents. Then he cut the connection, dismissing the deaths of hundreds of children as casually as someone might dismiss spilled coffee. On his flagship, Vec realized his targeting error, but said nothing, hoping no one would notice. Thrak did not care enough to investigate the mistake. On Novaju, parents rushed to the school site, hoping desperately for survivors. There were none. The medical response teams arrived and found nothing they could do. No one they could save. Governor Yuna stood at the crater's edge, looking down at where a school had been, and something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but her faith in the system that had led them here. On Earth, Fleet Admiral Quan received the incident report within minutes of the strike. She read it twice, making sure she understood correctly, then sat very still for a long moment. Her hands were steady as she activated a private communication channel that had not been used in over a century. She began contacting the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military leaders of human civilization. It was time for a conversation they had been avoiding for 100 years. Ambassador Hyan learned about Nova Ju while sitting in the Galactic Council chambers. Someone handed him a message, and he read it standing there in front of 46 other species representatives. His face showed nothing. Years of diplomatic training, keeping his expression neutral. But inside, something fundamental shifted. He requested an emergency session of the full council, and began preparing a speech that would change everything. On the endless patience, Dai Jung's crew sat in stunned silence, processing what had happened. Hana was crying quietly at her station. Tammin had stopped talking entirely. Bora asked her captain what they were going to do now, and De Jong had no answer yet. He stood on his bridge looking at the stars, thinking about children who would never grow up to see them. The galaxy did not know it yet, but something had broken on Nova Ju. Not just buildings and bodies, but the foundation of understanding that had maintained peace for a century. Humanity's tolerance, stretched thin over decades of provocations, had finally found its limit. News traveled fast in the age of faster-than-light communication. Within hours, every human colony knew about Nova Jeju. Within days, every human in the galaxy had seen the names and faces of the dead children. The response was not loud or dramatic at first. It was quiet, a deep silence that spread across human space like ice forming on still water. On the farming colony of New Seoul, workers stopped in their fields when they heard the news. They stood motionless for several minutes, then resumed their work with harder, angrier motions. On the mining station above Titan, crew members gathered in the common area and watched the news broadcasts in complete silence. On Earth, in the great cities where billions lived, people went about their daily lives with a heaviness that had not been there before. Parents held their children tighter. Teachers looked at their students differently. Soldiers who had spent careers training for wars that never came felt something change in their purpose. The anger was universal, but it was cold anger, the kind that did not burn out quickly. It settled into the bones of human civilization and waited there, patient and absolute. Governor Yuna sent a message to every human colony in the network. It was not a political speech or a call to action. It was simply the truth. She said that for 100 years, humanity had chosen peace. They had sacrificed, compromised, and retreated, always believing that patience would eventually lead to understanding. Nova Juju proved that belief was wrong. Some species would never understand anything except strength. And it was time humanity remembered how to be strong. Captain de Jong sat in his quarters, staring at a message from Earth Fleet Command. The orders were encrypted with codes he had learned during training, but never expected to use. When he decoded them, his hands shook slightly as he read. Then his hands steadied. He had spent 3 years negotiating, 3 years watching his people get pushed around, 3 years swallowing his pride for peace. Those 3 years were over. He walked onto his bridge where his crew waited, all of them looking at him with questions in their eyes. De Jong's voice was quiet but clear, as he gave orders that surprised no one and everyone at the same time. All hands to battle stations. This was not a drill. The ship that had spent years pretending to be weak was about to remember what it really was. The endless patience had been built in the orbital shipyards above Earth 20 years ago. Most people, including most of De Jong's crew, thought it was a diplomatic vessel with light defensive weapons. They were wrong. The ship was a warship that had been disguised as something peaceful, and its disguise was very good. Hull panels that looked decorative actually hid weapon batteries. Sensor arrays that appeared scientific could target enemies with precision. The engines were twice as powerful as anyone suspected. Ambassador Hyon stood before the Galactic Council in their great chamber. Representatives from 47 species watched him with varying degrees of interest and concern. Many of them had heard about Nova Ju but considered it a minor incident, the kind of thing that happened sometimes in the complicated business of galactic politics. They expected Hyon to request aid, maybe ask for sanctions against the Vrex, possibly propose new safety protocols. What Hyon said instead made the entire chamber go silent. He spoke calmly, each word chosen with care, but the meaning was clear enough to shock even the most dense representatives. For 112 years, humanity had chosen peace above all else. They had negotiated when others threatened, compromised when others demanded, retreated when others advanced. They did this because they believed in the possibility of a better galaxy, one where conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than violence. That belief had limits, and those limits had been reached. Humanity would no longer negotiate from a position of assumed weakness. They would no longer surrender their interest to maintain peace with species that did not value peace. They would no longer stand by while children died because someone thought humans were too soft to respond. The galaxy was about to learn something it should have learned a century ago. Humanity chose diplomacy not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to have a choice. The Vex representative stood to object, calling Han's speech unnecessarily emotional and accusing humanity of overreacting to a simple accident. Several other aggressive species murmured agreement. They had been profiting from human tolerance for decades and saw no reason for things to change. What they did not understand, what none of them understood, was that everything had already changed. Fleet Admiral Quan sat in the command center deep beneath Earth's surface, watching dozens of screens showing human military positions across the galaxy. She was an old woman who had spent most of her career managing a military that never fought. She had joined the service 50 years ago, when humanity still remembered how to wage war. She had watched that knowledge fade as peace became the default, the only option anyone considered. But the knowledge had not disappeared. It had been carefully preserved, updated, and refined. Every officer in human service knew the basics of warfare. Every ship captain had studied tactics and strategy. Every colony maintained defensive systems that had never been activated. Earth's military had spent a century preparing for a war they hoped would never come. And now it had come. Quan broadcast a message on all Earth military frequencies. A message that used codes and phrases that had been waiting 100 years to be spoken. Protocol Havoc is now active. Those 4 words changed everything. Across human space, military commanders received additional orders. Diplomats were recalled. Defensive systems came online. Ships that had been pretending to be civilian transports powered up weapons that no one knew they carried. On Nova Ju, Governor Yuna watched Vrex ships in orbit through her office window. She had received a message from Earth Fleet Command, telling her to prepare her people for military action. After a century of retreating, humanity was about to stand its ground. She felt no satisfaction, no joy in the knowledge. Too many children had died for anyone to celebrate. But she felt something else. Something that had been missing for a long time. She felt hope. Captain de Young's crew worked with focused intensity, transforming their ship from diplomatic vessel to combat-ready warship. Hana plotted attack vectors with a skill she had learned in training, but never used in practice. Tammin prepared the medical bay for casualties, though he hoped there would be none. Bora ran diagnostics on weapon systems that had been dormant for years, finding them all perfectly functional because human engineers never stopped maintaining them. The Vex fleet around Nova Jeju had no idea anything had changed. Thrak was pleased with how things had developed. The death of some children had finally motivated the humans to move faster. He expected full evacuation to begin within his 6-hour deadline. He was already planning which parts of the planet his settlers would claim first. On his flagship, Weapons Officer V had managed to hide his targeting error. No one had questioned the strike. No one had investigated. The Verex military culture did not value precision or care about collateral damage. Results mattered. Methods did not. V felt no guilt about the children, because Vri psychology did not include much capacity for guilt. They were a species built on conquest and dominance, and soft emotions interfered with those goals. In human space, something else was happening. Civilian transports suddenly changed course, revealing themselves as military vessels, heading to defensive positions. Research stations activated weapons that astronomers supposedly used for studying asteroids. Cargo haulers opened their holes to release fighter craft that were definitely not cargo. Every piece of the massive deception became clear at once. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity had been playing a very long game, and the game was ending. The transformation of the endless patience was beautiful, in a terrible way. Hull panels slid aside with mechanical precision, revealing weapon ports that had been hidden for years. Targeting systems came online. Sensors that had pretended to study stars now locked onto enemy ships with deadly accuracy. The ship that had been a symbol of human diplomacy became something else entirely. Something that made Thrax's flagship looked primitive by comparison. Captain de Young opened a communication channel to the Vrex fleet. His voice carried none of the diplomatic politeness that had characterized every previous conversation. It was cold, flat, and absolute. He gave Thra exactly 1 minute to surrender his ship and submit to trial for war crimes against civilian populations. 60 seconds to make a choice that would determine whether he lived or died. Thrax's response was laughter. The idea that a single human ship would threaten his fleet of 12 warships seemed absurd to him. He had fought many battles across his career, conquered many worlds, and never once had he retreated from someone weaker. Humans were weak. Everyone knew this. Their century of constant surrender proved it beyond any doubt. He ordered his entire fleet to open fire on the endless patience, expecting to vaporize the annoying diplomatic vessel, and then continue with the planet's evacuation. The first Vex volley consisted of dozens of plasma torpedoes and particle beams. Enough firepower to destroy a small moon. None of it reached the endless patience. Point defense systems, far more advanced than anything the Vrex had encountered, intercepted every single shot. Lasers picked off torpedoes, while shields absorbed beam weapons. The human ship sat in space completely undamaged, surrounded by the dying light of exploded munitions. Then the endless patience returned fire, and the Vex learned what humanity had been building during their century of peace. The first shot was a railgun round, moving at a significant fraction of light speed. It punched through Thrax's flagship shields like they were paper, through the armor like it was cloth and out the other side. The massive Vex warship simply exploded, torn apart by kinetic energy that exceeded anything their engineers thought possible. 2 more Vex ships died in the next 30 seconds. One took a missile that somehow dodged every defensive measure before striking the engine core. The other got hit by multiple laser batteries, carving it into pieces with surgical precision. The remaining 9 Rex ships tried to scatter, their captains suddenly understanding that they were not hunters but prey. Da Young's crew worked with calm efficiency. Hana calculated intercept courses faster than the V-Rex could change direction. Tamman monitored life signs on enemy ships, marking which ones still had living crews. Bora managed power distribution, ensuring weapons never ran low on energy. They had trained for this their entire careers, and training became reality with smooth perfection. 4 more VC ships died trying to escape. The endless patience was faster than they expected, more maneuverable, better armed, and crewed by people who had finally stopped pretending to be harmless. Within 10 minutes of the first shot, only 3 V-Rex vessels remained intact, and they were broadcasting surrender on every frequency they could access. But Nova Ju was not the only place where humanity revealed its true capabilities. Across the galaxy, at every border where Vrex forces threatened human interests, the same scene played out with minor variations. Research stations turned out to be heavily armed fortresses. Cargo ships revealed themselves as cruisers. Mining facilities activated weapons powerful enough to threaten capital ships. The Vex Empire had spent decades building forward operating bases near human territory, staging areas for future conquests. In a single coordinated strike, humanity destroyed 70% of those bases, not with massive fleets or dramatic invasions, but with weapons that had been hiding in plain sight for years. A communications relay would suddenly fire missiles. A scientific probe would activate and destroy everything in range. The attacks were precise, calculated, and devastating. Within 72 hours, the Vrex Empire's forward fleets were crippled, not completely destroyed, because humanity did not need to destroy them. They only needed to demonstrate overwhelming superiority. To prove beyond any doubt that continued aggression would be suicide, human forces broadcasted the same message to every Vrex ship and base. Stand down immediately, submit to war crimes investigations, or be eliminated. The choice was simple. Most Verex commanders chose survival. Their ships powered down weapons and waited for human forces to take them into custody. A few chose to fight either from pride or stupidity, and they died quickly. The Vrex High Command, watching their military disintegrate in real time, tried to issue orders for total war, but their ships could not fight what they could not match. And their commanders were not willing to die for an empire that had led them into this disaster. The galaxy watched in shocked silence as the doormats revealed they had been lions all along. Intelligence agencies across dozens of civilizations scrambled to update their assessments of human military capability. How had they hidden this much power? How had no one suspected? The answer was simple but hard to accept. Humanity had been honest about wanting peace, and everyone assumed that desire for peace meant inability to wage war. On the Galactic Council station, Ambassador Hyan received updates from the front lines. He showed no satisfaction, no joy in the military victories. His face remained carefully neutral as he prepared for the next council session. Many species were demanding explanations, some were panicking, and a few were trying to distance themselves from the Vrex as quickly as possible. Fleet Admiral Quan coordinated operations from Earth, managing the largest military action humanity had undertaken in over a century. Her screens showed battles being won across multiple sectors. Human casualties were minimal. Enemy casualties were substantial, but not excessive. The objective was not genocide or conquest, just the absolute establishment of boundaries that would not be crossed again. She thought about the 347 children whose deaths had triggered this response. In a way, they had saved countless others. If humanity had continued allowing itself to be pushed, eventually, some species would have pushed too far and sparked a real war, one measured in billions of dead rather than hundreds. Better to establish limits now, clearly and undeniably, than to wait until the cost grew higher. Captain de Jong accepted the surrender of the 3 surviving Vray ships. His crew processed the prisoners efficiently, separating commanders from regular crew, identifying anyone who might have ordered or participated in the attack on Novaju. Thrax, second in command, now the ranking Rex officer in the system, asked De Jong why humanity had waited so long to show their strength. The captain's answer was simple. Because we hoped we would never have to. Because we wanted to believe that words could solve anything, that patience would eventually lead to peace. You made that hope impossible. You killed children and laughed about it. Now you learn what happens when humanity stops being patient. On Novaju, Governor Yuna watched Vrek's ship surrender from her office. She felt no triumph, only a deep weariness. The colony had been saved, but 347 of her people were still dead. No military victory would bring them back. She began making arrangements for a memorial, something permanent to remember what they had lost, and why they had finally chosen to fight back. Across human space, the message was clear. Humanity had tried peace for a century. They remained willing to negotiate, willing to compromise, willing to find diplomatic solutions, but they would no longer allow that willingness to be mistaken for weakness. They would no longer pay the price for peace with innocent lives. The galaxy had been given a warning, delivered in fire and steel, and no species would ever forget it. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so full or so tense. Every species sent their highest-ranking ambassadors, and many sent military advisors as well. The usual comfortable atmosphere of diplomatic discussion had been replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Species that had been confident and aggressive last week now sat quietly, recalculating their positions in a galaxy that had suddenly changed shape. Ambassador Han entered the chamber, flanked by Fleet Admiral Quan and a full military escort. This alone sent a message. For a century, human ambassadors had arrived alone or with minimal staff, emphasizing their peaceful intentions. Now they arrived with soldiers, and those soldiers carried weapons that everyone knew were far more dangerous than they appeared. The age of assuming human weakness was over. Han's speech was not long, but every word carried weight. He explained that humanity had chosen diplomacy, not from weakness, but from principle. They had believed, genuinely believed, that intelligent species could build a civilization where conflicts were resolved through words rather than weapons. They had sacrificed for that belief, compromised for it, retreated for it. But belief had to be mutual to work. And it was clear now that many species never shared humanity's vision. The deaths at Nova U represented a line crossed. Not just because children died, though that was horrible enough, but because those deaths came from contempt, from a fundamental disrespect for human life and human sovereignty. The Vex had killed those children carelessly, dismissed their deaths casually, and expected humanity to simply accept it as the cost of staying weak. That expectation was wrong, and correcting it required force. Jan made it clear that humanity's military response was not revenge, but recalibration. The galaxy had operated under a false assumption about human capabilities, and that false assumption had encouraged dangerous behavior. Now the truth was clear. Humanity possessed military power comparable to any species in the galaxy, and they had possessed it the entire time. The only thing that had changed was their willingness to pretend otherwise. The Vrek's representative tried to speak to defend his empire's actions, or at least minimize their responsibility. Admiral Quan cut him off with a single sentence. The Vex Empire no longer had standing to speak in this chamber until they addressed their war crimes. The representative started to object, then noticed how many other species were nodding in agreement, and sat down quietly. The terms humanity offered the Vrex were harsh, but not impossible. Complete withdrawal from all Quillan territories occupied in the past 50 years. Full reparations for destroyed worlds and displaced populations. War crimes trials for any commander who ordered attacks on civilian targets. Inspection protocols to ensure demilitarization of border regions. The Vrex Empire could accept these terms and survive, or reject them and face systematic dismantling of their military infrastructure. The Vrex High Command held an emergency session that lasted 18 hours. They reviewed casualty reports, damage assessments, and projections for continued conflict. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. They could not win a war against humanity. They had thought they were fighting sheep, and discovered they had attacked wolves. Pride demanded they fight on, but survival demanded they surrender. Survival won. Other species that had been testing human borders suddenly found reasons to revisit their territorial claims. The aggressive lizard-like Koran Dominion, which had been harassing human mining operations for years, sent formal apologies and proposed new treaties recognizing human sovereignty. The insectoid Threan swarm, known for expanding into any space they perceived as weakly defended, pulled back their forward colonies and requested diplomatic talks. It was remarkable how quickly aggressive species became interested in peaceful negotiation once they understood their targets could fight back. Claims that had been absolute and non-negotiable last month became flexible and subject to compromise this month. Resources that were described as vital to survival suddenly became less important. The entire diplomatic landscape shifted in days. Captain De Jong oversaw the peaceful withdrawal of Rex forces from Nova. The occupation had lasted less than 2 months, but it felt longer to everyone involved. Breck's ships departed one by one, their crew subdued and quiet. Some looked angry, others looked afraid, but none looked contemptuous anymore. They had learned respect the hard way. Thrax's former second-in-command, a Vex officer named Kresh, who was now the highest-ranking survivor from the original fleet, asked to speak with De Jong before leaving. The captain agreed, curious what the Vrex wanted to say. They met in a conference room aboard the Endless Patience, just the two of them, with guards stationed outside. Kresh asked the question that was bothering him most. Why had humanity waited so long to demonstrate their strength? If they had this much power all along, why suffer through decades of being pushed around? Why allow the Vex to take so much before finally fighting back? De Jong's answer was simple and sad. Because we wanted to believe in a better way. Because we hoped that patience and kindness would eventually be reciprocated, because we did not want to be the kind of species that solves problems with violence. What changed? Kresh asked. De Jong's response was equally simple. You killed children and felt nothing. That showed us that some species would never understand peace, would never value life beyond their own interests. We could keep hoping and keep losing, or we could accept reality and establish boundaries that you would actually respect. You made that choice for us. On Nova Juju, Governor Yuna presided over the memorial dedication. The entire colony attended, humans and Quillen together, standing in silence as she read the names. 347 names, each one a life cut short of future erased. The memorial was a simple stone wall with every name carved into it, and at the top, a single sentence. They died believing in peace. Their memory demands justice. The Quillen refugees wept openly during the ceremony, grief for the human children who had welcomed them, mixing with grief for their own losses over the years. They had fled Vex aggression, only to see it follow them, only to watch more innocents die. But they also saw something else now. They saw that humanity had finally drawn a line, and that line would protect both humans, and those humans chose to shelter. Fleet Admiral Quan began repositioning human forces across the galaxy, not as conquerors or occupiers, but as enforcers. Human ships patrolled borders that had been porous before, making it clear that unauthorized incursions would be met with immediate response. Human stations established monitoring networks that tracked potential threats. Human colonies activated defensive systems that made them far harder targets. The message was consistent across all human space. We prefer peace. We prefer negotiation. We prefer finding solutions that benefit everyone. But those preferences are not weaknesses to exploit. They are choices we make from strength, and we will defend those choices with whatever force proves necessary. Test us if you wish, but understand that testing has consequences. Now, Ambassador Hyan worked with moderate species on the Council to establish new protocols for territorial disputes. The old system had favored aggressive species because it assumed everyone would negotiate in good faith. The new system included actual enforcement mechanisms backed by human military power and supported by other species tired of constant aggression. Not everyone liked the changes. Some species had profited greatly from the old system, where might made right, and humans absorbed the consequences. They grumbled about human imperialism, about humanity imposing their values on everyone else. But they grumbled quietly, because loud complaints had a way of attracting attention, and human attention was dangerous now. 6 months after Nova Ju, the galaxy had found a new balance. It was not perfect, not peaceful everywhere, but it was better. Aggressive species still tested boundaries, but they did so more carefully. Diplomatic negotiations still happened, but they happened between parties that respected each other's capabilities. The strong still tried to dominate the weak, but the weak now had protectors who could actually protect them. Humanity had become what they never wanted to be, what they had spent a century trying to avoid becoming. They were enforcers, the galaxy's police, the species that backed diplomacy with force. It was not the dream they had cherished, but it was reality, and they accepted it, because the alternative was worse. The ship, formerly known as the Endless Patience, had a new name. Now, Captain de Jong stood on the bridge of the Remembered Children, looking at the nameplate that had been installed last week. His crew had voted unanimously for the name change, wanting to honor those whose deaths had transformed everything. The ship still performed diplomatic missions, but it no longer hid what it was capable of doing. Negotiations went differently now. When Da Jung arrived to mediate a dispute, both parties knew that behind his words sat weapons that could destroy fleets. This knowledge changed behavior in interesting ways. Species that might have dragged out negotiations for months suddenly found ways to compromise quickly. Demands that once seemed non-negotiable became flexible. The presence of force, even unspoken force, made diplomacy more efficient. Officer Hana had stopped having nightmares about Nova Jeju, not because she had forgotten, but because she felt like those children's deaths had accomplished something. The galaxy was safer now for other children, human and alien alike. She still mourned them, still visited the memorial whenever the ship stopped at Nova Jeju. But the mourning had purpose now. Tommen agreed with her, though he kept his thoughts private. Bora simply said that engineering made more sense than politics, but even she admitted that sometimes politics needed engineering solutions. The Quillen species was thriving for the first time in decades. Protected by human guarantees backed by human weapons, they had begun reclaiming their lost worlds. Rex forces that once occupied Quillen planets had withdrawn, and Quillen colonists returned to homes they thought they would never see again. Some worlds were damaged beyond repair, but others could be restored with time and effort. The Quillen government, such as it was, had offered to join a formal alliance with humanity. Ambassador Hyan carefully explained that humanity was not building an empire, not collecting client species, not trying to dominate others the way the Vex had, but they would honor defense treaties with species that shared their values, species that wanted peace, but lacked the power to maintain it alone. The Quillen became the first species to sign such a treaty, but they would not be the last. Other peaceful species watched what happened to the Quillen and made their own calculations. The gentle traders, an aquatic species that had been losing territory to aggressive neighbors for years, requested human protection. The archivists, a species devoted to preserving history and knowledge, asked for defense guarantees for their library worlds. Slowly, carefully, a network emerged of species that wanted peace and were willing to align with humanity to maintain it. Captain de Jong found this development troubling in some ways. It looked too much like empire building, too much like humanity becoming the dominant power they had spent a century avoiding becoming. But Governor Yuna, during one of his visits to Novaju, offered a different perspective. The strong have always dominated the weak. The only question is whether that domination serves justice or serves exploitation. We did not choose this role, but we can choose how to perform it. Fleet Admiral Quan was getting old now, thinking about retirement. She had spent 50 years in military service, most of it managing forces that never fought. Then, in the span of a few weeks, she had coordinated the largest military operation in human history. It had gone well, minimal casualties on both sides, objectives achieved efficiently. But it still kept her awake some nights, wondering if there had been another way. If the century of patience could have ended differently, her successor, a younger admiral named Jiwan, who had been her tactical officer during the Vrex conflict, had different ideas about how to manage human forces. Jiwan believed in more visible deterrence, in making sure potential aggressors understood human capabilities before testing them. Quan worried this approach might seem too aggressive, but she understood the logic. Better to prevent conflicts through clear demonstration than to wait for provocations that required violent response. Ambassador Hyan continued his work at the Galactic Council, but his role had evolved. He was still a diplomat, still someone who preferred words to weapons, but he negotiated from a position of strength now. Other ambassadors treated him with respect that bordered on fear, and he was not entirely comfortable with that, but he used the fear productively, pushing through reforms that would have been impossible in the old system. The Council instituted new protocols for territorial disputes. Species that made claims on occupied worlds now had to prove their claims through historical records, rather than military threats. Attacks on civilian populations, which had been common and rarely punished, now triggered automatic sanctions and possible military intervention. The rules were not perfect, but they were better. and humanity enforced them when others would not. On Nova Jeju, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The crater where the school had stood was now a park surrounding the memorial. Children played there, which some people thought was inappropriate, but Governor Yuna encouraged it. The dead children would not want their memory to be a place of only sadness. They had been happy, playful, full of life. Let the living children honor them by being children. New families continued arriving at Nova Jeju, attracted by the colony's reputation for successful human-Quillen integration. The population had grown past 90,000 now, and plans were being made to establish satellite settlements. The colony that nearly died had become a symbol of humanity's transformed role in the galaxy, and settlers came because they wanted to be part of that transformation. The Vex Empire still existed, but was much reduced. War crimes trials had resulted in executions for some leaders, and imprisonment for others. The Vrex High Command had been completely replaced, and the new leadership was more moderate, more willing to accept that expansion through conquest was no longer viable. Some Vrex still dreamed of their empire's former glory, but most accepted the new reality, where aggressive expansion met swift punishment. Other aggressive species had learned similar lessons. The Koran Dominion signed non-aggression treaties with humanity and reduced their military budget. The Threan Swarm, faced with human demands to stop expanding into neutral space, actually complied rather than fighting. Species that had operated through intimidation for centuries discovered that intimidation had limits, and those limits were enforced by beings they had once mocked. Throughout the galaxy, a phrase emerged in multiple languages that roughly translated to remember humanity's tolerance. Different species meant different things by it. For aggressive species, it was a warning not to push too far, not to mistake patience for weakness. For peaceful species, it was reassurance that patience had limits, and those limits would be defended. For humanity itself, it was a reminder of what they had lost and why they finally chose to fight. Captain de Jong received a distress call from a mining colony on the frontier. The message was garbled, but mentioned raiders attacking, casualties mounting, no help available. He ordered Hana to plot the fastest course, told Bora to prepare all systems, and informed Thyman to ready the medical bay. The remembered children moved to respond as humanity always had, ready to help. But now, when they arrived with enough power that help could not be refused, that raiders would face consequences, that the innocent need not fear protection coming too late. The ship's weapons were charged, its shields were raised, and its crew was ready for whatever they found. They still hoped for peaceful resolution, still preferred negotiation to violence, but they carried the capability to enforce that preference. As the ship jumped to faster than light speeds, De Jong thought about the past year and everything that had changed. Humanity had spent a century building a reputation as peacekeepers, mediators, compromisers. That reputation still existed, but was now backed by demonstrated power. They were no longer the galaxy's doormats, but its protectors, not by choice, but by necessity. The stars looked the same as they had a year ago, but the galaxy beneath those stars was different. Species that once solved problems through violence now hesitated before attacking. Peaceful civilizations that once lived in fear now had allies who could defend them. The strong still tried to dominate the weak, but the weak had protectors, and those protectors had teeth. It was not the galaxy humanity had dreamed of, not the peaceful utopia they had hoped to build through patience and understanding. But it was better than what came before, safer for the innocent, harder for predators. 347 children had died to teach the galaxy that humanity's tolerance had limits. Their deaths purchased a new order where other children might live without fear. The remembered children dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the mining colony, ready to face whatever threat awaited. Captain de Jong looked at his crew, saw them ready and capable, and felt something close to pride. They were still diplomats, still preferring words to weapons, but they were also warriors now, and the galaxy was better for it. No species forgot the day humanity's tolerance snapped. More importantly, no species forgot why it snapped, what it caused, and what it changed. The lesson was written in the names of dead children and enforced by the guns of their survivors. It was not a gentle lesson, not a kind one, but it was necessary, and in the end, that was what mattered.